Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, and today I would like to do the third part in my series against the French. And today we're going to talk about the MacCutcheon variation, which arises after we do our normal French moves against the French, bishop g5, bishop b4. And this is an ancient variation going back more than 100 years and has been played many, many times. And the idea, like almost all French variations, is to force white to commit this pawn on e4, to make him tell us what he wants to do with it from the black perspective. Now, the first question we could have is, well, what happens if he just pushes the pawn? Doesn't that look really bad for black? But in fact, it's not so simple. For example, black's then going to play h6, and here many, many moves have been tried. I'm going to give two variations just to give you a sense of what the MacCutcheon's all about. In the first variation, this was a game I played as black against International Master Feingold, the U.S. Championship 2003, and that game was kind of instructive, not only for this opening, I thought, but the French in general. He took the knight, I took the bishop, he took the pawn, rook g8 was played. And at first glance, it looks like white has really wrecked my kingside position, but in fact, if we look, I have a very nice pawn chain here, and I've gotten rid of his e5 pawn. That pawn which was on e5 is now on g7, and I should be able to capture it soon. So despite the fact that my kingside looks weakened, black's position is actually entirely okay. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this game was, to my mind, it has a lot of the similar themes that we talked about in other French lectures, namely the control or the fight for e5 and d4. So that game went h4. I played knight d6, quickly developing and hitting the key squares e5 and d4. He played h5. Now I have to take the thing. Bishop b5. Queen f6. So I've gotten rid of that pawn on e5, so now my queen can come to f6, where it also hits these critical squares. Queen d3 was played. Bishop d7. I pushed. The pawn isn't so important. It's going to fall at some point. Knight f3. Bishop d6 covering the key e5 square. My bishop wasn't doing anything anymore on b4. He castled, and now I just simply kick the knight out of the center. I believe he took, and since he didn't want to go back where he would just lose the f2 pawn, he played knight e5. But then in a way I accomplished the dream of the French. I eliminated both the e5 pawn and the d4 pawn. So, in this variation of the MacCutcheon, black is completely okay. And even though it looks like white has a big attack against black's kingside at first, he's actually losing a lot of his central flexibility by getting rid of his e5 pawn. Now, the traditional way to play against the French, which I'm not going to recommend for the white side, is to play after h6 to play bishop d2. And then the problem is white has to then be ready for this variation. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e4, queen g4. Again, the same ideas that we've seen in other lectures against the French. The queen needs to come to the king side to harass black's king. And after here, black has two reasonable moves, king f8 and g6. g6, I think, is probably the best move. And here it's actually very hard for white to get an advantage, and black has many different ways to play. But in general, he's going to play c5, and he's going to attack these weak pawns on the queen side, and white's king is inevitably going to end up on d2 after the trade knight takes d2, king takes d2. And this line I've played many times for black, and I consider it just completely playable for black. So notice in all these things that we get kind of typical French structures with the pawns locked on e5 and d4. So what I'm going to recommend today is something a little bit different. One of my friends, Alan Stein, who played at the U.S. Championship recently, told me something interesting, in that he said that a good way to play psychologically is to try to change the structure of the game. And this changing the structure of the game will often have a debilitating psychological impact on your opponent. And so I'm going to recommend a way of playing that Robbie Adamson played against me in the World Open 2003, and I thought it was very hard to meet psychologically as black, and I think it's definitely a good move, a good way to play. What he did is he played pawn, take the pawn. So he's changing the structure of the normal French. Instead of pushing the pawn to e5, we're now going to get some kind of different structure, which most black players aren't going to be familiar with, and that's why this is generally a good try. And also, black's going to have to really thread the needle in terms of getting a playable game here. The first point is after pawn takes pawn, if black plays pawn takes pawn, it really isn't so great, because now when we compare the position in particular of the bishops on g5 and b4, this one on b4 really isn't doing too great. So, for example, white could continue something like this now. Queen f3, attacking the knight. Say, knight d7, castle. Now we're threatening knight takes pawn. Maybe then bishop e7, bishop d3, castle, knight h3, or knight e2. Knight e2 might even be a little bit more flexible. And we're going to actually have very good chances for a kingside attack from white's perspective. And black has a lot of problems to solve, in particular the bishop on c8. So this is just a very nice position to play for white. Notice that the main feature is that black had to waste time doing something with his bishop on b4 that was misplaced. Okay. So right away, if they play pawn takes pawn, we have a reasonable game. A very nice game for white. So the testing continuation for black is to take this pawn now with the queen, which threatens the bishop. And of course, white can't play knight takes queen because the bishop is pinning the knight. So the first thing white does is play bishop takes knight. So we're already going to achieve at least a debilitation of the black pawn structure. And now, black has to be very careful. He really has to play bishop takes knight now. Because the problem is, if he plays pawn takes bishop, white can simply play queen d2. And now he is threatening knight takes d5. And here white has a very nice game, because it's hard to see what black's going to do now. If we say trade the knight, then white's the one with the beautiful pawn structure, and black is just poor. He's got the weak pawns. So that's not a very appealing situation for white, for black, I mean. So black has to be very sensitive here and now take the knight. An intermezzo or in between move. Pawn takes. Pawn takes. You know what Robbie played against me, I thought was a very interesting move, and he said he had seen it in a book, but I've never seen it in any of the other games, and as far as I know, our game is the only game in the database with this particular plan, the way he played it. So queen g4, and now I played what was thought to be a move, I think, just silencing the venom in queen g4. I just played queen g5. And it looks on first sight that everything is fine for black. But here Robbie played a very interesting move. Queen g3, and this was his preparation for the game. And this is what I would recommend for our white players against the MacCutcheon. So we've put now black in a very uncomfortable situation. First, he had to thread the needle a little bit just to get here, and secondly, right here, he's in big, big trouble. So the problem is that on queen g3, white creates a very menacing problem with queen takes d7, and black really can't allow that. So I took the queen, he took back hg. And this, I think, is a very instructive position, because white now has, I would say, a clear advantage. His rook, in particular, on h1, is much, much better than my rook on h8. And my rook on h8 is essentially just enslaved to the pawn on h7. And because of that, his weak pawns, black's weak pawns on f6, and this complex of f7, f6, e6, and this weak pawn on h7 are going to be much easier to attack than white's weak pawns on d4, c3, and c2. So this is a really good example of kind of an opening to the endgame scenario where white's going to get a clear advantage. Black can try many things here, but the enduring factors of the position are going to be hard to resolve. I played in the game bishop d7, and I think here Robbie played inaccurately. He played castles, which I think really wasn't the testing move here. He played castles, and I believe knight e2, knight f4, which allowed me some play. Actually, excuse me, he played rook h6 first, which just put king e7. So, but I think the way to do things here is just to try to stop me from achieving my little setup, which is going to be bishop c6 and knight d7. So, just as an example, I think rook b1 would have been very strong. The point of this is now, after, say, bishop c6, white has bishop b5, and it's very unpleasant for black. I really don't even have any great recommendations here. The problem is I'm actually threatening to play bishop takes bishop and then rook takes b7, and it's very hard to deal with that threat. And if the only way out of it is kind of just to take the bishop oneself, but then notice something like this can happen, and it's the end of the world already. White's going to crash through. So I think this is a very powerful way to play against the MacCutcheon, both, I think, objectively and also psychologically changing the structure of what black's used to. Now, if I could give a recommendation for black, I think what I would say is that in this position, he could try something like king e7. But this is a very, very dangerous position for black to play, in particular because white can always invade with queen g7. Very unpleasant. And white here could even play something simple like bishop d3. Doesn't he have to rush with queen g7? And the general plan will be queen g7, knight either to f3 or e2 castles, and black's king is going to be left out in the middle. So, this recommendation is very simple in a lot of ways, has some very simple but potent ideas behind it, and it avoids a lot of the theoretical stuff that you'd have to learn in this early phase of the game. And the difficulty of the situation with playing e5 for white in this position is, it's not that it's a bad move, but that you're really entering black's territory here, because if your opponent played bishop b4, this very ancient variation, which has been analyzed extensively, he probably knows what's going on in those variations and feels fairly comfortable in them. And as someone who plays the MacCutcheon himself, I can testify that I'm happy if to see e5, we're just going to get into a standard French-like struggle. However, e takes d, changing the nature of the position, is very uncomfortable to deal with. And then, just to review, this position, queen g3 is a very, not only a nice example of how to play against the MacCutcheon, but of an idea which has very deep endgame goals in mind. Because queen takes is more or less forced, pawn takes, and now white's position is just so much better based on the activity of his pieces, in particular the rooks. The rook on h1 and the rook that can come to b1. So here I actually won this game, but I think white just cannot be displeased with this position here. He's definitely much better, and I was shocked in my own game to find that an opening which I knew so, or I thought I knew so well, I suddenly found myself in a structure where I had no idea what was going on. So, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you've enjoyed part 3 of A System Against the French. Bye-bye.